Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome you at Astana al-Makia. Today we are going to talk about Plato once again, and in this lecture we will conclude about the contribution of Plato, and this is going to be the final lecture in the series of Plato. Now we have discussed the greatness of Plato as a critic, and in our previous video we discussed about Plato's art of criticism with reference to his theory of imitation. Let me tell you one thing interesting, that Plato had started his career as a poet, but in the company of Socrates, his teacher, he came to know the greatness of philosophy, so he turned out to be a philosopher. He could not attain success as a great poet, and then he switched his career from a poet to philosopher. So in his philosophy and his criticism, he severely criticizes poetry. But his criticism on poetry yielded some positive results too. We should not see Plato as a critic who is against poetry. If we will analyze criticism of Plato, we'll come to know that Plato was not against poetry, and he was not against good poets. As he was a social philosopher, he was a political philosopher, so he was interested in two things. He wanted that all art and all poetry should perform two functions. Number one, that poetry and art must mold character, means it must have utilitarian purpose, it must build up character, that the poetry of his time lacked in, and all the poets who lack in this important quality of molding the characters are not acceptable to Plato. Number two, Plato was social critic, Plato was social philosopher, he was interested in politics, so he wanted to promote the well-being of his state. And when poets lacked that quality, when poetry could not perform the function of promoting the well-being of a state, it was not acceptable to Plato. That's why he did not include poets into his Republic. Second, with the criticism of Plato, two things became clear to the world. Number one, Plato's theory of mimesis, means reproduction or copying, became the principle of art. After Plato, number of critics, number of writers came to know that art is the production, art is the copy, art is the reproduction of the things available. It can be reproduction of life too. Okay, so this is a very good and positive contribution. Second thing, when Plato talked about the art as a creative activity, Plato defined that art can be created too. Because in his discussion regarding poetry, Plato saw that poets believed to be divinely inspired. And when poets are divinely inspired, they do not create. So when someone is not creative, it is not acceptable to Plato. This is a very good thing. And if poets had been divinely inspired, then the doors of poetry were shut to other writers. When Plato described poetry as an art, means Plato opened the door of other poets that they can create poetry with efforts, with conscious efforts. They can learn the principle of composing poetry. They can learn the principle of knowledge, and then they translate them into their poetry. So new, generation of poetry writing began. That was acceptable to most of the writers, most of the authors, and most of the creative writers later on. So Plato has great contribution in the field of criticism. Plato was in fact a philosopher who wanted well-being of society. This thing must be kept in mind. Any poet, any artist, any author, any writer who is not working in the betterment of society, in personal development of people, in character building of nation, in well-being of a state is not acceptable to Plato. This is very much important, contribution of Plato. Then Plato, while defining the function of poetry, says that poetry is not simply to give pleasure. Poetry is not meant to provide only pleasure, but it must mold human character and bring out the best that is hidden in human soul. It is the major function of poetry, and then it became the major function of literature in later worlds. Plato's criticism is scattered. Plato did not write any treatise on criticism. We find his criticism divided into some elements of some portions of Republic, for example, Book 10 of Republic, and then his another work, Dialogues, where he has composed again social philosophy. There we find his elements of criticism. He also gave the theory of pity and fear. He believed that drama must arouse pity and fear, and it is function of drama. But he was not aware of the importance of pity and fear the way Aristotle did, because Aristotle took pity and fear as the elements for arousing catharsis. Plato was unaware of this term catharsis, and for simple arousing of pity and fear, Plato belittled the scope of tragedy. Otherwise, his disciple Aristotle later on, gave a greater theory on it. So when we sum up all these things, we come to know that Plato had great contribution in criticism, and he laid the foundation of systematic criticism. And later on, number of critics followed his style, followed his definition, followed his canons, and even today, because Hegel's idealism is based on Plato. Even today, Derrida, when deconstructs something, he starts from Plato. So Plato has great place among world critics. He was great classical critic, great writer, great philosopher, and we all endue all these things to him. I hope that I have cleared my point. Thank you very much for watching this video. This is Ibrahim Khokhar, presenting you this video on criticism. Thank you very much for your watching.